Welcome to Building Better Businesses, an ABA podcast. Learn firsthand from business owners who built successful ABA businesses. Utilize proven techniques and strategies to help your practice thrive. This is Building Better Businesses, an ABA podcast with Jonathan Mueller.
Sara Litvak completed her graduate degree from Claremont Graduate University. She's an adjunct professor for the ABA program at Pepperdine. Sara is a CEO and co-founder of the Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, the only ABA-specific accrediting body. She's an education blogger for the Huffington Post. She served as the past co-chair and of the Autism Special Interest Group at ABAI, on the board of directors for the Association for Science and Autism Treatment, and as a subject matter expert for the Behavior Analysis Certification Board. Welcome to the pod, Sara.
Thanks. I'm so excited to be here. I got to talk to one of my favorite people.
Yeah. Hey, right back at you. I am stoked for this conversation. And I thought the only place we can start, Sara, is with lobsters. And I saw on LinkedIn recently, you had this, it was a brilliant post. And it was about how lobsters and stress management interrelated. So what the heck lobsters and stress management have to do with one another?
So it's one of my favorite YouTube videos. If you haven't seen it, you can just search lobster, rabbi, stress. And those three keywords give you this amazing video. But it's this rabbi who basically is, opining on stress and lobsters. And he basically says that stress is actually very functional. So he talks about a lobster, how the reason that the lobster sheds its shell is because it grows. And so if you shed the shell, it gets really, really uncomfortable. And then as it grows, it gets really uncomfortable, it has to shed its shell, and then it has to go find another shell. And then it gets too big for that. And that process of discomfort creates change and allows it to go find a better home. And so he kind of talks about this idea that a lot of the times in today's society, instead of working through the discomfort, you take a Percocet, or you take, something to reduce the pain of the growth, and you kind of, mask it, and you don't actually get the benefit of the pain. And so I love that. And I've used it with students, and I've used it with the people I work with, and, friends, whenever people complain about how stressed they are. It's a good reminder that stress actually is a good thing, and it leads to growth and usually leads to positive outcomes. You can't really change or improve without stress.
Powerful. So stress or anxiety channeled in the right way actually creates growth. I think I saw, David Letterman, when he was talking about public speaking, he said he got nervous, like butterflies in the stomach, every single episode before he went on. And, he was one of the best at it. And I think that's just reinforces your example of positive, productive stress and anxiety that helps us grow.
Yeah, there's absolutely non-functional stress and anxiety, but when it's functional and when it works, it can do really good things.
Right. And that wisdom is telling the difference between the two, or I think I'm conflating metaphors. I'm not sure. But yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Sara, you're you are an entrepreneur in our field. And tell me a little bit about your entrepreneurial journey.
Sure. Well, yeah, it's funny because you're right. I'm a behavior analyst, but also have been always entrepreneurial, throughout my childhood and life. I've always kind of, started businesses and had an interest in kind of creating value in a broader scale, and going against the norm a little bit and innovating. And so I've kind of had a couple different endeavors over my lifetime, starting with, I used to run a website that was a Yelp type website for families who had special needs children. They could go online and find service providers, restaurants, movie theater, anything you wanted. They can go on and kind of see special needs friendly organizations that could support them. So that was kind of one of my first endeavors that, as an adult, obviously I had, other things through college and things like that. And then, what was interesting with that is I noticed that the idea was that parents would have to review, the services that they got. And we noticed very quickly that parents didn't really want to talk to other parents. They wanted to talk to a professional, and they wanted to be told which therapy provider to go to. They wanted to be told, which physician to go to. And so I realized that we started kind of calling these providers saying, hey, tell me a little bit about your practice. How many staff do you have? How many this do you have? And I started basically doing a mini audit over the phone to figure out whether they were a good provider to refer them to for these families. We had thousands of families who we were placing, right? And so that very early on became like a big part of what I realized, which is there was really no vetting system to figure out whether an organization was quality or not. So that kind of led me into this venture, which, I talk about ventures seems like it's like a project, but it's really become a big part of who I am and a big part of the legacy I hope to leave within applied behavior analysis, but, essentially creating the first accrediting body for applied behavior analysis that hopefully can help improve quality for patients who have special needs, and also help improve organizations and help them grow and be better and continue to iterate. And, like we talk about, Jonathan, like, be 1% better every day. And I think accreditation is a big part of that. So yeah, that's a little bit of how I came to be the CEO of BHCOE, and obviously have had other fun projects along the way that taught me a little bit about what it means to start a business and scale something.
Nice. Scott Belsky, who is, I think he's a former, I don't know, C-suite leader at Adobe. He wrote this book called The Messy Middle, and it talks about the entrepreneurial journey and how it's like everyone celebrates like beginnings and endings, and yet it's hard. Like it's freaking really hard being an entrepreneur, and our audience are ABA business owners, right? And leaders who are doing this all the time. So I want to ask about like, what's the hardest thing about being an entrepreneur that no one thinks about?
It's such a good question, because I think I've been an entrepreneur for so long that I take some of those things for granted. But, as I always say, I'll have a 15-minute meeting with anyone. And I have that on my Twitter. I have that on my social media. And I get a lot of people reaching out, like asking like, hey, like, how did you get started? Those types of questions. And I think the biggest thing that I notice that is tough for folks who haven't done it is the idea that no one tells you what to do every day. And I think that's a huge adjustment. Is like when you're an entrepreneur, when you own your own business, or when you kind of, there's no one telling you, hey, you got to wake up because you got to do this thing. You have to somehow find that passion or drive internally to tell you and guide you what you need to accomplish every day and then what to prioritize. So I think that's one of those things that I think I take for granted, is that I've never had that. So it's easy to put that in forward. But I think for people who aren't used to it, that's probably the biggest thing is, you can boil the ocean. There's so much you can do every day, but something has to tell you, well, these are the top priorities. This is going to move the needle the most, and this is the priority. So that would be my suggestion to entrepreneurs. I would say for myself, I think the hardest part is, you have to just always realize, I tell my team this all the time, the things that are hard today, you're going to look back on in a year or 2 years or 3 years, and they're going to seem easy. And there's going to be a whole new set of things that are hard in that moment in time. And so I think so much of the entrepreneurial journey is the idea that everything seems hard and a lot seems easy, and those things are constantly changing. So there's a lot of things that, are not always hard and always easy. There's just, you're every day you're dealing with a new challenge. So.
What came to mind when you said that was, it's almost like kids, right? And I've always been told, I've got 3 young kids, like little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems. And it's probably the same for like organizations, right? Or an entrepreneur.
100%.
Small endeavors, small problems, big endeavors, big problems. Well, Sara, tell me more about like accreditation more generally, like really big picture. What role does accreditation play in any field?
Yeah, it's actually funny. I've, in my time working in this area of quality assurance over the last decade, I really poured myself into the literature to figure out, like, where did this come from? Like, how did we come to be where there's this third party that's not the government kind of like overseeing things? And a lot of this kind of predates to like the war era, where like weapons were being created and there was a need to kind of regulate the development of some of these things. And that's kind of early days. There was regulatory piece related to nuclear weapons and things like that. And then as we became more industrialized as a society, a lot of that regulation started applying to like food preparation and the way machinery worked. And just, it really came down to the need to really protect the people, like the consumers of whatever product or equipment you're dealing with, and to protect the workers, right? So when you think about like the Industrial Revolution, it's like, how do we make sure workers are safe? And then how do we make sure consumers who are getting the products off the line are getting good quality, right? So I think that's kind of historically, when you think about that, it exists all around us and we have no idea, right? The example I use a lot is like you pick up your phone, there's usually like a little U with the circle around it. And that is on every electronic device that you that you own, and you probably don't even realize it because you just take it for granted. And that's the Underwriters Laboratory. They're, an independent organization, a for-profit organization that regulates the entire electronics industry, and make sure that your phones aren't exploding in your hands. So anyways, I'll start by saying that there's a very long history of this and just general consumerism. And then in the hospital system, this really started in the early 1900s, where medicine started evolving, and there's this idea of, great medicine isn't an experiment anymore where they're just like taking out organs and playing with them. Like, when medicine first started, they're kind of like, oh, we can help people, and this is how we help people. And let's make sure we don't kill people while helping them, right? Let's make sure we try and reduce some of the mortality happening with that. So then, in the 1900s, you really saw accreditation really start regulating the hospital system and some of the practitioners around it. And that, it's very different from licensure, but you can't talk about accreditation without talking about licensure and certification. So, all of that kind of comes together to just say that I think ultimately, when you think about an industry or a profession, the goal largely of that profession is to help, right? It's to be innovative, it's to create, it's to improve quality, right? Whether it's a medical profession, whether it's a, even like I think about like plumbing or engineering, right? It's to make things better. And then you always have to have bumpers. Whenever there's people trying to make things better, you need bumpers to make sure that people are making things better and not doing it in a way that can impact a large group of people or can damage damage our ability to do better, right? Because I always joke about this, where unfortunately we're always judged by the lowest common denominator, right? You have one bad priest, you have one, right? Like you have these things that happen that kind of get stuck to a profession or get stuck to an industry that you really want to avoid, and that's where kind of bumpers come into place. And that's kind of what accreditation does: is it sets standards, and then it helps measure organizations across, against that standard, and make sure that they're following best practices and ultimately doing no harm.
Why is accreditation particularly important in our field, the ABA field?
Yeah. Look, I feel like this has been an interesting question, just because when I started BHCOE, no one knew what accreditation was. We had to kind of create the need for it, because I don't think we had a problem. That's what I'll say. And I'll talk about what that problem is and why accreditation is important. But I don't think anyone put accreditation as their way to solve the problem. And that's what I felt really strongly about. So the problem that I'll share with you that I think accreditation solves is that we have a rapidly growing field where every single day you have tons of people graduating with a degree in behavior analysis or something that allows them to practice. You have thousands of people becoming board certified behavior analysts, thousands of people becoming RBTs, and you have organizations who are opening up on every corner who say they provide applied behavior analysis. You also have the advent of, autism mandates, thanks to some of the powerhouse parents who really fought for this, where now insurance covers it. So you have this market dynamic, which basically, again, intended to help kids with autism, but also has no bumpers to prevent any type of problems that may happen in the field. So whenever you have a rapidly growing field, my concern has always been that there's a very low barrier to entry, so anyone can provide care. There's a lack of training and standardization, so there's no bumpers, right? So there's no one saying this is good ABA or bad ABA. And then I think you have this influx of providers and influx of kind of, private equity and all these, these organizations who are scaling really rapidly. And ultimately, we have a certifying body that looks at the individual, but we don't have anyone who is really looking at the organization. And in my experience, I found that, you have we know from an OBM perspective, put a good person in a bad system, the system wins. You put a bad person in a good system, the system wins. And so when I was looking at some of these problems, I thought, well, how do we fix the system, right? Because you can pump out fantastic behavior analysts, but if they're going into an organization that doesn't have the best system, that doesn't invest in growth and training and development, that doesn't have an ethics officer, that doesn't, put their people first every day and measure their satisfaction and focus on, there's so many things, but ultimately, you want organizations to meet those standards. And so I felt that accreditation was a big part of that, is making sure that organizations kind of understand what are the bumpers, what does quality ABA look like, and that they can measure themselves against it and then get third-party validation on that. So that's how I felt accreditation can really help some of the challenges that I think the field is really up against.
So well said, especially because, and I won't get on my soapbox, but there's this sort of existential, almost crisis, I think, facing our field, that ABA is perceived as a commodity service. That is, there's no way to differentiate quality. And what a scary, scary place to be for a family, a consumer of services, for a payer, for an ABA provider themselves. So it just seems like a no-brainer that whatever we're able to do to demonstrate a commitment to quality is really critical. And that's in best case scenario, right? Think worst case scenario, that there's the negative press ABA is getting, right?
Yeah. Well, and also I think when I think about like these like powerhouse parents who fought for the autism mandate, they fought for it based on their anecdotal experience. Like, ABA changed my child's life, right? Or they cited these studies like that Lobos did that were from the 90s, right? And today we're in 2022, and you're thinking about the idea that, okay, what do we know today now that care has been delivered in most states for multiple years? How do we really demonstrate the impact of that care on this population? And I think, when you're in a medical model, you have to be able to demonstrate that. And I have serious concerns that if providers aren't providing quality care, we're not going to be able to demonstrate that effectively. And so a part of that accreditation piece, I think for me, is how do we make sure that we're setting up organizations for success when that question comes around, so they can point to their data sets and say, look at how we change these children's lives. So, and I think a lot of what we do helps with that.
Well, there's lots of different, not lots, there are some different options for ABA providers around different accreditations, from CARF to Joint Commission to BHCOE to CASP is coming out with accreditation in 2022. Gosh, as like a small ABA business owner out there who's listening to this, like, help give me some tools, like how should a provider be evaluating their options and which is the right accreditation for them?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, I might throw that question back to you, Jonathan, as someone who's been through the process too, but I think you'd probably have a lot of insight on it in terms of how you evaluated it. But I can tell you from my perspective, accreditation isn't for everyone. And I think I'll be the first one to say that. I think, first of all, organizations need to be in a place to invest in that type of, I would say, self-care from a business perspective. It's just like any other system that you're investing in within your organization. Is you have to kind of look at, do you have the people and the resources available to invest in that type of work? So, I definitely suggest, if you're going through an EMR transition, if you're going through these big nugget transitions, probably not the best time to try and do something like this. My biggest thing that I would say is, when you look at accreditations, you need to make sure that it's appropriate for your type of business. So I know that in the past, organizations have used things like CARF or Joint Commission just because there wasn't any other option. And those just don't tend to be applied behavior analysis specific. So we always pride ourselves in saying, look, we know ABA, we kind of are specific to that. I think the other part is, historically, accreditation has not been very economical. And so we've done our best to make sure that it's cost effective and that there's direct return on investment for, every dollar you spend on it. And that's something we really pride ourselves on, is that, you will feel like this was well worth your spend because of the feedback you'll get and the benchmarking and the, continuing education units and, some of the other pieces that we offer. So we think of it as not just for the certificate, but the ongoing support and community that you get once you also achieve that accreditation. So I think there's a lot of those factors, but ultimately it's such a personal one for organizations. And I think timing is a big piece. I think resources, and then the people you have available to really do that. But curious what you think as someone who's been through that process.
So here's where full disclosure comes. I am, and my organization, SEM Behavior Partners, are the biggest fans of accreditation. And BHCOE accreditation. We've been through we're going through our 5th accreditation round with the Practica. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But so anyway, I'm a huge proponent. I'm a homer for accreditation. And you know what I liken it back to? Would I take my kiddo, my 6-year-old, to an emergency room that wasn't accredited? Hell no. Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, there's clear signaling value and a commitment to what you described around continuous improvement. That's important. So we actually evaluated the BHCOE, Joint Commission, and CARF, and we had a detailed framework. And listeners, DM me. I will send you that framework originally. And it really came down, Sarah, to what you described. It's like, this felt like us. These were the kinds of clinical quality measures. These were the operational best practices. These were the right kinds of survey questions. of our team members and client families that applied to the organization we were building and to the the kinds of services we were providing. So it became a no-brainer for us. And I really appreciate that BHCOE has a preliminary accreditation that allows a much smaller provider getting started to go through almost like, hey, let's put your training wheels on first to make sure you got it. So that's how we made it. And I'll say this too. I mean, it's like, this is not a layup. There are accrediting bodies in other fields that are like, oh, you just check some boxes and pay, like send a check off. You're accredited. BHCOE
it's definitely not a pay.
It was really freaking hard. Like, no, it was really hard. And it's like, and we thought we do. I've been in the field a long time. And I was like, oh no, we thought we knew everything. And then came back and was like, holy shit, like how much I didn't know. I'm so glad that we now understand what we're going through. So
that's so funny. And
anyway,
we have a good team too. We're always iterating. And I think that's the other part is we're constantly updating our standards based on what's going on in the industry and payer requirements. I mean, there's so many things, but yeah, we've appreciated how you guys have been what I call super users of everything we put out and, have been giving us amazing feedback. So it's been a really fun journey with you all.
Right on. So many ABA providers, Sara, see this like inherent trade-off between growth and clinical quality. Do you think there's a trade-off? Why or why not?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's definitely a hot topic. I think especially with the advent of, private equity and venture capital joining the industry. And I don't know if you heard the recent, SoftBank even just recently invested in a provider, which is, if you're familiar with SoftBank, I mean, they're massive. So I think that those conversations are important because I think that it's the age-old question across any business is how do you continue to grow and scale efficiently and effectively and make sure that quality doesn't suffer. And I think I've been very vocally on the side of the fact that I think growth and quality have to go together because I think there's such a thing as perfect is the enemy of good. And I say that even with accreditation, right? Like I think there's such a thing as perfect standards and then there's good standards that can grow and evolve, right? So similarly with the clinical care they're providing, I think, there's a difference between being a research institution where you're publishing all of your results of your patient care in a scientifically peer-reviewed journal. And then there's the applied world where, you're not doing all these things in a vacuum. You're doing it in a kid's house where there might be siblings running around and, there's all these other factors. And so I say that more to just say that I think we have to grow as a field because there's too many kids not getting care. And so to me, it's not one or the other. You can't just say, we're going to focus on quality or we're not planning to grow this year, right? Because that's just as bad as saying we're going to grow and not focus on quality, right? Because you don't want to just focus on one. You have to do both. You got to grow so you can get kids access to care. But I think that's a big part of what I think our goal is to make sure that folks are doing it in a way that's ethical and sustainable so that as they grow, they don't lose quality behind. And it's a moving target. And I think we try very hard to be partners with organizations along the way so they're not having to figure it out on their own. I think we try and say, hey, you're dealing with the struggle. Well, we know 25 other providers are dealing with the same struggle, and this is how we're adjusting our standards to make sure that you guys are aware that this is something you need to be investing in. I think ultimately, just to wrap up the point is accreditation isn't there to tell you that you're incredible or you're amazing. It's there to tell you that you have the tools to do that, to be amazing if you do it right. And that ultimately you have the systems in place to catch it when you're not being amazing, right? So you will have at some point in your career as a business owner, you may have an employee that just goes rogue, right? Like they do something terrible. But what you want to be is in a place where you had the system to catch it. You figured it out, you dealt with it in the right way, and you basically remediated the situation as quickly as possible. And that's what that allows you to do, is make sure that you continue to provide care, you do it in a way that is quality, and that you're able to catch those things as they happen so that you can make sure that your patients get the best care.
You know what analogy I see here, Sara, is like accreditation is almost like excellence. Excellence is not a destination. You don't arrive at excellence and say, oh, like we're good. Excellence is this journey, and like you're constantly getting like a little bit better every day, like you mentioned. And accreditation, same thing. It's not a destination. That's the beginning, right? As you said, like this, you get in. There's all kinds of other benefits around community, et cetera. Sure. But it's that commitment to continuous improvement that's critical. Hey, tell me, like for ABA organizations whom you've seen who have done this well, that is grow and continue to improve clinical quality. What's their secret sauce? Pinpoint. for what they're doing right?
I think it starts from the top, and it also starts from the bottom. And what I mean by that is I think most of the organizations that blow me away are ones that have incredible leaders, right? They're people who you can talk to human, where there's this no bullshit approach, right? It's just this, it is what it is. There's transparency, there's openness, the servant leadership approach. But when I say it also starts from the bottom, is it starts from the top, and then that person dictates that the bottom level of the organization matters most, right? And so they kind of, I like it to, like, they flip the pyramid and say the people that work for me are, and we say this at BHCOE too, is, your first customer is always the people that work for you, right? You can't care about your actual customer if you don't care about the people that work for you. And I think that's a key component of running a quality organization. I think the other ones, kind of when you take that at the step level, let's assume you have this great leader and then you have these great people who are happy working for that leader. I think the other piece is a focus on outcomes, and a focus on understanding, is the patient making progress, and investing in systems that allow you get that information, whether it's technology, whether it's a tool internally that you're using, whether it's a framework that you've adopted. It's kind of looking at, how do we make sure that the patient is progressing, and then taking it a step further and saying, what else can we measure that we know is important for our organization? So I think the measurement piece is really key. What would you say, Jonathan?
Oh my gosh. So this is going to sound really obvious. You got to talk about it, right? This is not like, I've seen organizations where you try to sweep it under the rug and it's like, ooh, we're going to grow surreptitiously, right? Or going to allude to things. And I don't know, I think it's the kind of thing that leaders, to your point, has to start with a leader, has to demonstrate like a vision and mission for the organization that says, not only are we going to keep improving clinical quality, but guess what? The CDC last December just came out with a 1 in 44 kids diagnosed with autism. I personally feel, Sarah, if Ascend does not grow, I am not doing what Ascend was meant to
100%
put into the world to do.
Yes,
and that is to serve kids.
That's exactly what I was trying to say with the growth and quality. It's like, you can't say I'm focusing on quality and not growth. It's like, we got to do both. Like, there's just no way around it.
Yeah. And so and you know what? Let's be honest. It's like fucking really hard. It's really hard to do. It's one thing like for me to talk about. It's really hard. And so that's where I think, quote unquote, winning in this is doing the intentional and hard work every day of building the right kind of culture that reinforces the right values, that you care about quality and outcomes like you described, you care about families.
For sure.
You're great at building therapeutic relationships, and you're putting in all the right systems and processes, which means you're constantly investing. Like it does. This stuff does not come, growth and clinical quality don't come for free. It takes investment. Couldn't
agree more.
Well, it's a good segue, because the BHCOE recently in the fall just came out with the BHCOE outcomes framework. So what was the need you saw in our field that drove that?
Yeah. So this has been an incredible effort on our organization's part. I want to just, say that it took a village 100% to put something like that together. But what we've been collecting outcome measures for all of our, from all of our organizations for the last 6 years. And one of the biggest challenges we noticed is that there's just a lack of consistency of how outcome measures are being collected. And I like to think we have one of the largest data sets when it comes to patient outcomes, based on the last 6 years of data and based on the hundreds of organizations we've evaluated. And with that massive data set, the data were so crummy that we couldn't really do much with it. The goal, and we, as you go through we do report outcome measures back to you all in the report. So we do give you some information, but it really wasn't getting at the right things, because we'd noticed that assessment tools were being used for a kid that's shouldn't be getting that assessment tool, right? Like, it's the wrong age, or they have a deficit that is not covered in that tool that's being used, right? So they may lack social skills and they're being given an assessment tool that doesn't measure social skill, right? So we were just like, this isn't even giving us the right information. And we just noticed a huge need for clinicians and organizations to really be aware of what are the different criteria that you should be looking at when selecting an assessment tool, what kind of training is required, which ones are free, which ones are norm referenced and criterion referenced, because we also see a lot of kind of homegrown tools where people are just making stuff up and saying it's a tool that we're using, and trying to get funders to approve it. So I think we just were seeing the chaos that was happening, and also noticing, kind of back to my comment of like, we're going to have to demonstrate results at some point, right? aside from just the patient's progress. We're going to have to demonstrate on a broader component. And also, value-based care is becoming a big piece of the conversation. And we're already seeing payers start to put those contracts in place. I know three payers already have those contracts out that are, working with pilot groups that we've been involved in. And so, knowing that that's the case and knowing that some of those value-based care contracts don't even have an outcome measure is a little scary, right? Like you have value-based care contracts that are not actually measuring the progress of the patient, was a little concerning to us as well in terms of what is being incentivized. And if you're incentivizing the time spent in therapy, you're incentivizing a provider to exit people out of therapy, not because they've improved, but because their time is up. And so, a lot of those things were happening, and we very quickly realized that we need to provide some education and guidance as to how to select appropriate tools to measure outcome. And the way we looked at it was, first and foremost, every ABA provider needs to be doing some type of autism severity tool. Second, they need a norm reference tool, a criterion reference tool, and then there's a fourth section that suggests areas related to quality of life and stress and some of those ancillary measures that we think supplement some of those. So we've seen really great adoption and really great feedback, and we're really excited to see payers even looking at it as an opportunity for them to embed into some of those value-based care systems in the future. And we're excited that hopefully the aggregations we pull for future accreditation reports are even more robust than they've been.
The quest to get great and actionable data. I love that. And by the way, the whole quality of life and like stressors component, thank you for describing that, because ABA in a child doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
Like it takes this family and other support like set of structures around it, and it's a really hard treatment. And so our ability to measure that feels really important.
Yeah, the patient voice is
so there's all kinds of the patient voice. Yes, exactly. And for those who don't have a voice, making sure there is some way to capture that. So there are other outcomes frameworks. I don't know if I even call them that, but that are kind of emerging in our field. And so an example is like, the ICHOM autism standard set. So gosh, as an ABA provider, like how should we think about which one of these we should be using?
And it's so funny because Ivy Chong, who's the chair of that program, is a good friend and colleague of mine. And, throughout the process, we've both been kind of elbowing each other, like, how's it going? And I think what's exciting about that is that one group should not own something like this, right? I think that in most professions, there are multiple approaches to measuring these things, and it's healthy, right? And it's acceptable and it's appropriate. And so I'm actually really impressed with what's been put out by ICHOM and Ivy's team. And I think it's really exciting to see. I think when she and I talk about it, we try and even to figure out how do we explain it. And I think what we've come up with as far as like the audience is different. So our framework is focused specific to the BCBA and the clinician. And so like all of our tools, for example, can be conducted by a BCBA. And I think they included some medical specific measures that maybe the audience is more targeted to to physicians or like the medical audience. So, those are some of the general, comparisons we've made, but we actually plan to submit a couple presentations and panels over the upcoming year. So excited to have those conversations in a broader form and panel format so we can kind of share the processes that went into that. But I would say in general, when you think from a provider perspective, I think you just want to look at the methodology. And I know that both use the Cosman method, which is kind of best practice. I think you want to just make sure that, the tools that are being recommended meet payer requirements, and you're always deferring to your state licensure requirements and all those other things. Because I know even we put out a tool like ours, and ICHOM puts out one, and you have a state that says, hey, you're not allowed to do that in my state. You're not allowed to use that tool. So I think it's very individualized. And I think as a provider, you really have to look at like, what does my state allow me to do? What do my licensure laws tell me I can do? What do my payers allow me to do? And then how does this fit into it? And then ultimately use it as a tool and then adjust accordingly based on those individualized factors.
Well, one thing I've appreciated about BHCOE is there have been new accreditation standard sets that have come out. And for example, like right around COVID, there was a telehealth accreditation, which it was like super, we went through, it was super eye-opening. But BHCOE recently announced a Practica accreditation. What's your vision for that? How's it going to create value for our field?
Yeah, I was so excited about this project, and the way that it actually came about is about right before COVID hit. So it was about a year and a half prior. I was at a brunch or breakfast meeting with a couple local faculty members from the region. And, they just wanted to get together to talk about some of their pain points and just, just schmooze, catch up. And, they essentially were like, they told me, they're like, look, we use BHCOE accreditation to tell all of our students, when you're looking for a practica site, you should go to an accredited site, because that's really the only way we can measure quality, unless we have a personal relationship with the owner of the company that's not accredited. Like, I went to grad school with them and I know they're good, you know what I mean? So, but they're like, as our programs have grown, and we talk about these ABA businesses growing, but what we haven't talked about is the universities are bursting at the seam too, right? Because there's such a high demand for clinicians and to pump out BCBAs. So universities are going through the same growing pains. And as they scale, and it's no longer a 20-person program, it's now a virtual 500-person program, they're trying to figure out, where do we place our students? And knowing that that group of faculty were telling me that they're using our accreditation to place students, I kind of said, I just want a full disclosure. We don't actually have a section in our full accreditation on practica, so I kind of told them, like, it's good, like, that's a good thing you guys are doing that, but there's actually, we look at supervision and training and oversight for BCBAs, and then the same thing for the RBTs, but we're not really looking at like an RBT who's on their way to become a BCBA, who's getting their hours, like that middle tier. So I just said, full disclosure, like, that's not there. And they said, well, like, can you create that? And they were like, why don't you just make that? I was like, it's not a bad idea. So I think the pain we were trying to solve too, just, in terms of that conversation, but also the idea that, oh, there we go. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. my video popped on and off. So I think the conversation along with the faculty that we had was also the idea that what we noticed is across those 3 universities, they all were vetting one organization 3 times, right? So these 3 universities all made one ABA provider fill out paperwork for all 3 of those universities to like showcase that they were an approved practica site. And so I kind of said, hey, if we came up with something that was specific to this and you just outsource that to us, would you guys find that useful? And they were like, can you do this yesterday? So we were a little delayed because of COVID. But, very quickly after that settled down, we did that. And, very grateful we have Ellie Kazemi as our chief science officer, who's published a lot in supervision and kind of, leadership. So it was a big area for her that she's really knowledgeable in. And we had a great group of subject matter experts across all the different universities that came in and really supported us with it. But, now what I'm excited about is we did launch it, and we've had a really robust pilot group who's going through it. And we have a couple of universities who are going to be replacing their practica approval process with our accreditation starting in the fall. So I'm hoping it really reduces the burden off the universities, and then also sets our students up for success so that they get really great supervision and experience, and they can really hit their BCBA. Once they get their BCBA, they can hit the ground running and have had good training. And again, we're trying to fix the system, but part of the system is that we need to train staff the right way. So when they do get into a good system, they're adapting nicely. So I'm hoping we can close the loop there.
That's right. And I'll add one other thing on top of it, that like, think about the great resignation that we've been facing for months. And I saw a recent stat, like 10% of the workforce has like left their job in the last 90 days. So anything that any employer, and especially in our field, can do to demonstrate to candidates that like we walk the walk and talk the talk around quality and the commitment to continuous improvement, it feels like that's important.
Absolutely.
Well, Sara, what's something that every ABA provider should start doing, and what's something that every provider should stop doing?
Oh, that's a good one. I would say, I think every ABA provider needs to start measuring staff satisfaction and patient satisfaction. I notice a lot of them, especially as they're smaller, aren't really listening to the patient voice and aren't really listening to their staff voice. And I think that's something that sometimes for smaller organizations, I think goes unnoticed until they're broader, and then they start measuring these things and realize, I even heard, I was on in a call the other day, I heard a provider say, oh, we don't want to survey our staff until we fix a bunch of stuff because we know they're not happy right now, right? So even hesitancy to survey because they think that people will be unhappy. And it's kind of like, well, I don't not do an assessment on a child I'm working with because I think they're not going to meet the goals, right? So I think getting in the habit of measuring often and regularly is so important. And it's something that we do with our patients, but we don't necessarily do with our business. So I would say that's a big one that I see. And then I think, what they should stop doing. That's a good one too. I mean, maybe it goes back to this conversation, Jonathan, about like, equating growth with evil or bad, or, this idea that growth is bad. I think if we could kind of rid ourselves of that mentality, I think we'd be in a much better place as a field, because I think that ultimately our work isn't done until all the kids can get the care they need. And I think right now growth has such a negative connotation that I think is really limiting us.
Yeah. Oh, I have so many thoughts around all that.
Please share.
Amen and amen. Well, and I don't know. I think we have to start channeling like our inner preschool, like share and collaborate, and we have to stop the bickering and infighting about anything. 100%. I don't care. Like there's lots of important stakeholders in our field, and we have to honor those stakeholders, because those stakeholders are here. It doesn't matter who that is: payers, investors, providers, families, candidates, accrediting bodies, trade associations, and I don't know. The world feels to me like a better place when we actually engage in thoughtful dialogue instead of like throw barbs.
100%.
Well, some of our listeners, might not yet have started a practice, but they're probably actively considering it. What advice would you have for them, Sara?
Yeah, I think that I think I'd go two ways with it. The first one is, I think I would really ask yourself if you want to do this, because it's a very fast moving train that once you're on, it's very hard to get off. And then I think the other piece too is just really being honest with yourself about, if you're a clinician and you want to start an ABA practice, understanding that if you're going to be a CEO or executive director, you are not going to be practicing clinically, and you're going to be giving up your clinical focus. And I think that's a lot. I see a lot of business owners struggle with that. Like, I used to have so much contact with, I used to do so much on the clinical side. And so just making sure you're comfortable with that commitment and that sacrifice that you're making for the field. So I think that, and then being very honest with yourself about the skills that you have and the skills that you don't have. If you're a clinician who's never taken a finance class, make sure you have that person who understands finance, whether it's a consultant, whether you're bringing on a CFO, it's someone who can do your finances. But I think you definitely want to learn a lot of that stuff, learn it quickly, and then figure out what you can outsource and what you want to keep internally to yourself. Because I think what you don't want to run into is you're dealing with a very serious business that is in the medical world, where you're dealing with things like antitrust laws. You're dealing with fraud and billing and waste and abuse. And these aren't small words. They're things that can really have an impact on your livelihood, on your family, on your ability to really succeed if you don't take them seriously. And so just making sure that you are legally up to par, that you have an attorney, all those other things. I can't encourage you to just think enough about the fact that this is not a side project and it's not a hobby. It's a full-time commitment that impacts the lives of the people you're servicing and the people who you employ.
Well said. Just because it's easy to legally incorporate a business, that it is doesn't make it easy to start a high-quality business and grow that business in the way that you originally intended your vision is.
Absolutely. Well, and I was going to say, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say, if all of that doesn't scare you, then go for it. That's what I was going to say.
Right. And talk to people who have done it. Right. That's like one of the most important things, like getting really good at curious and asking good questions. And I'll be the first, like anyone, DM me, call me, and I will share all of the tens of thousands of things that I failed at. That hopefully, I can pay forward so you don't. Well, Sara, you and Dr. Roni Malko are co-founders of the Autism Investor Summit, and the 4th Autism Investor Summit is happening momentarily in February. And I've always said this is one of the most interesting conferences in our field. And the reason is because, you've got just like an amazing range of stakeholders, from small ABA business owners to C-suite and CEOs of big ABA companies to investors to, you've got payers there. It's just this like melting pot of like intellectual stimulation. And what was your inspiration for starting the Investor Summit? And why should an ABA owner or leader in our field consider attending?
Yeah, you might notice a theme, Jonathan, where that I see a problem and then I try and fix it. And usually it comes out in some way or another. But I think this is the fix. I'll tell you what the problem is, and the AIS was the fix for it. And the problem that we saw when Ronit and I started it was, back in 2015, Ronit was writing a book on private equity entering the field. And what we quickly realized, she asked if she could meet me to interview me for her book. And so I said yes. We ended up meeting at my office, and very quickly realized she and I were one of the only clinicians in the field who really were collaborating with people from the private equity world. Anyone else you would talk, and this is, 6 years ago at this point, or 7 years ago at this point, there were not a lot of transactions that had been done. And not only that, you would see that there was a lot of, in social media, or even in these conferences, there'd be someone in the private equity world who show up wearing a suit, so you could kind of tell who they were at these conferences right away. And they were like the pariah, and no one really wanted to deal with them. And there was this kind of like evil, like, stay away. And what we had also realized was that Ronit had sold her company, one of the first large private equity sales that happened. And I was actually pulled into some of the early acquisition diligence. So if you're not familiar with the acquisition world, when a private equity firm wants to buy an ABA organization, they go and they check the company to make sure that, they're all clean, and they'll check your financials. They check a bunch of things, but they also want to check your clinical quality. So I would be brought in saying, hey, can you just check if they're quality, right? You guys do accreditation. Can you go evaluate them in the same way you would for accreditation, and just check that they're quality? So the process looked the same, but it was, someone else asking us to do the work. So very quickly we started, rolling out some of this, these evaluations. And I realized that private equity guys just wanted to know what were the rules and which lines they can't cross, right? So they were like, if you tell me this is not ethical, we're not going to do it, but like, I have not read that anywhere, right? So we realized, like, they actually like rules, they like standards. And because the field didn't have any standards, they were just doing things that were, I very, very rarely found organizations who were doing things because they knew it was wrong. They usually didn't know something was wrong. And so as soon as they got that guidance, they very quickly were like, oh, thanks. Like, we didn't know that, right? And at that point, BHCOE was a year or two old. And so now, we have relationships with a lot of these groups where they're looking at the standards and understanding what they can and can't do. But so long story short, what I'll say is that these organizations these private equity firms were just looking for guidance. And we realized there was no safe place for those people to get educated on the market and what quality looked like. And there was also no safe place for business owners to talk about this transaction. It's a big decision to sell your business, a huge decision. And these ABA conferences were not the place to do it. And then there was really no place for all of that conversation to happen in a way that's mature and that's based on trends in the industry and growth and what are the patterns we're noticing. And similar with payers, we typically have a payer day right before the investor summit, where we have payers come out and talk about what's kind of pressing for them. And so that conference did really become this big conglomerate of payers and providers and private equity. And it really became something that I became really proud of, just because I do think it's a really unique perspective that we don't really get in other types of industry conferences. And I do want to say that when we first started it, we would rarely see private equity walk away from deals. So we would say, you probably don't want to buy that. There's some problems, and they'd buy them anyways, right? And I'm really proud. I think a lot of, because of some of the education we've done in the Investor Summit, is the last couple of years, I've seen more people walk away from deals than close deals. And I think it's because some of the market dynamics we've seen, but also maybe some savviness of the buyer, understanding that not every ABA provider is quality.
Yes. And to throw it out there, I mean, Ascend is we're proudly independent, and have not considered a sale, but we've been, every year for 4 years because of what we can learn. So this is not just for providers who are looking to sell their business, but if you're like me or like a Sara who loves to learn and engage with interesting people, it's a great place. Well, let me ask, and I'm going to share first. So what's the most insightful presentation that you had that you've seen at the Autism Investor Summit? I'll share mine. I think it was 2 years ago. It was Scott, and I'm not remembering his last name, on technology. And he said, I'm going to show you a video of a Formula One pit stop in the 1950s. And he shows the video, and it's about 1.5 minutes, and it's cool, people running around in this pit stop for a Formula One racing car. And then he said, all right, I'm going to show you a video of today, what a pit stop looks like. Pay close attention. And he started it, and literally, like, 3 seconds later, it was done. I mean, it was unbelievable how far and this is Formula One pit stop racing. Who could have thought this was interesting, but how far it's progressed. And I think his analogy was like, look at turn your lens inward, right? And think self-awareness wise, where is your organization when it comes to technology and service to outcomes and service to, operational best practices, whatever it is. And think about where you could be or maybe where you are. So I think that was an awesome one. What was your most insightful presentation?
So I have to say, when you asked me this question, I wasn't thinking about AIS. I just thought in general the last 4 years of any presentation. So now I have to rethink this. Gosh.
Oh, that's fine too. Hey, dealer's choice, Sarah. Any presentation at any conference is totally good.
First of all, I remember that presentation that Scott gave, and it was actually incredible. And he's an incredible speaker. So I love that. I was actually going to say, Jonathan, that I have been like devouring these, what are they called? The master classes. And that's actually where I was going to go. I don't know if you watched Masterclass or not, but they have these experts who give these presentations on like any topic you want. And so I just finished the Chris Voss one on negotiation. He was a negotiator in like the Middle East, and he gives a master class on negotiating. And it is fantastic. And that's just, that was like, honestly, when you asked me, like, that's what came to mind. I wasn't thinking about AIS, but I'm sure I can think of a good AIS conference too.
Chris Voss, that's going on my reading list, a masterclass on negotiating. Love it, Sarah. And if anyone has not read the book, by the way, Getting to Yes, it's all about negotiation. Powerful, powerful, powerful stuff. So you think about negotiating with insurance companies, or you think about negotiating with ABA providers, anyone. If you're going to negotiate for a new lease, read Getting to Yes.
Even I think he does a lot of examples with his teenage kids, actually, which is funny.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I will check it out. But Sarah, before we get to our hot take questions, where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, I am at Sara the G on Instagram, Sara Litvak on LinkedIn, Behave in LA on Twitter, and I think that's about it. Those are the 3 that I really frequent, but would love to connect with you all and love to learn from you as well. So always happy to, like I said, have a 15-minute meeting with anyone that asks.
Oh, I love it. I'm going to start using that too. That's genius. All right. Are you ready for hot take? This is rapid fire, and it's just what comes to mind.
Sweet.
Okay, Sarah, you're on your deathbed. What's the one thing you want to be remembered for?
I'm going to go cheesy on this one. I think ultimately, I hope that all the work we're doing at BHCOE leaves a lasting legacy on improving quality of care and outcomes for people with autism and developmental disabilities. I think I would die happy with that in mind.
What's your most important self-care practice?
Ooh, I would say my 2-year-old daughter reinvigorates me. I would say if a day goes by that I don't get to like run around, go for a walk, giggle, tickle, all that stuff, I feel depleted. So I think that is a big one for me. And then I think aside from that, I genuinely love being outdoors. And I think anytime I can be outdoors, that really, really refreshes me.
That resonates. Well, if you could cancel all your meetings, skip all your responsibilities for a day, how would you spend the day?
I think I'm going outdoors. I'm like going on a really long hike, probably. I'm probably gonna, walk around the neighborhood, probably do a hike, maybe grab a nice lunch or something like that. Be with the people I love.
Best Madonna song ever.
Okay, I think Like a Prayer. First of all, I need to thank you for asking that question ahead of time, because my get ready routine this morning included all of Madonna's top hits, because I was like, you know what? I really need to think about this. So I've been listening to Madonna like all morning.
Oh, that warms my heart that you would listen to Madonna and prep. And by the way, if you have not seen, for you millennials, Gen X or Gen Zs out there, have not seen the Like a Prayer video, I think it came out in 90, 91. It was controversial at the time, and it's powerful. And it's what made me a lifelong Madonna fan. It's awesome. So check it out. Nice one. All right. If you could give your 18-year-old self, Sarah, one piece of advice, what would it be?
Okay, I had to think about it, and I can think of a ton of stuff, but ultimately what I would say to that question is it wouldn't matter because I wouldn't have listened. So I think My 18-year-old self will be like, I got this. Don't worry about it. I know what I'm doing.
A, for honesty, you and me both. We knew everything when we were 18, right?
100%.
What more could there be to learn? All right. And finally, you can only wear one style of footwear for the rest of your life.
Ooh, definitely rainbow sandals. I would say versatile. And also, I always wear sandals when it rains. I'm in LA because I feel like your feet are waterproof, but your shoes aren't.
Ooh, more life words to live by. Sara, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the pod. It's been awesome.
So fun. So nice chatting, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Building Better Businesses in ABA podcast. Stay tuned for our next exciting episode. In the meantime, please like, subscribe, share, and comment. We value your feedback. Don't forget to follow us on social media at elementrcm.ai.